Today in episode 21 of the Missionary Coach Show, we'll be continuing our Missionary Stories series with reading chapter 13 of Rudy Lack's book called Breakthrough. This chapter is called Black and White Do Mix. So in full-time Christian mission since 1999, I'm your missionary coach, Bill Hutchison. This is the show where we talk about all things missions related, from preparations, travel, training, relationships, building a support network, and more. You can find out more about the work that I do over at missionarycoach.org, where you can also find the previous 12 chapters of this book that we're reading right now by Rudy Lack. This is attempt number 2 of recording this chapter. I recorded last week and didn't get any audio. So hopefully this week works out to be a little bit better. So we will start with chapter 13 now. Chapter 13, Black and White Do Mix. Rudy, you're training the white middle class, but forgetting the black Africans. I was sitting in YM's third-story downtown Salisbury office, taking a coffee break with Gary Strong. By now, the two of us had become close friends. It had been a year since Gary had catapulted me into starting the Rhodesian SOE, or School of Evangelism. Now, God was using his direct and penetrating observations to once more redirect my life. His words stung deep. I shifted uneasily in my seat. You mean running a multiracial school? Gary nodded, his crop of auburn hair. I looked at him doubtfully. What Gary was suggesting was revolutionary. It's never been done before, I objected. There are no mixed racial schools in the country, even secular ones. I know, but we have to start somewhere. If the church doesn't set the example, who will? Gary commented. He was not talking from theory. His own church had led the way in a multiracial congregation. I turned in my swivel chair, stared through the window over the skyline of high-rise office buildings. I could have been in any Western city, but I was in Rhodesia. And like its neighbor, South Africa, it was a dominating white minority conclave surviving in a black majority population only by strict laws of apartheid. You're right, Gary, I agreed. But we're in a country where whites and blacks don't mix. It won't be easy. That's true, Gary admitted. And because the Rest Haven is an exclusive white area, you wouldn't be able to use that. But there are other places, the YWCA, for instance. It's not exactly the best area of town. No, but it would suit your purposes. I reflected on the contrast between the beautiful facilities at the retreat center of the outskirts of Salisbury and the decidedly less affluent suburb where the YWCA was located. In other ways, however, the 100-room hostel would make an excellent facility, and it had another added advantage. It was one of the few areas where whites and blacks were permitted to live side by side. Despite the difficulties it posed, I knew Gary was right, and even though blacks and whites did not mix in this country, I knew it was the right thing to do to go ahead and run a multiracial SOE. Shortly after making the decision, I was in the town of Bulawayo, a 5-hour drive south of Salisbury. We had shown a film, Breaking the Bamboo Curtain, which told of the persecution of Christians in mainland China, and I had challenged the mixed audience of their need to be involved in missions. I also mentioned our forthcoming multiracial school to be held in January. After the meeting, an African teenager came up to speak with me. My name is Salu Deka. I'd like to come to your school, he said forthrightly. I looked dubious at this tough young man. He clearly had little education. I was doubtful as to how he would fit, but I also caught his sincerity. I questioned him about his background. The 8th of 10 children, Salu had been born in a cow dung hut in the small mining village of Shabani, outside Bulawayo. His parents were so poor that when he was born, his mother could not even pay for the subsidized midwife care, so she had delivered him on her own. My dad works on building sites, Salu explained, but he's not home much. I hardly saw him as a kid growing up. Me and my brothers used to look after our family vegetable lot. With more than a little pride, Salu told me how as a lad, he used to ward off the elephants. It wasn't until I was 16 and came to work here at Bulawayo that I wore my first pair of shoes. How old are you now? I asked. 18. Salu went on to explain how he had been able to get a job as a mechanic, but how the lure of big city life had drawn him away from his mission school upbringing. Like his brother, he got caught up in the Black resistance movement. Then, in May, just a few months earlier, Salu had attended a tent mission. That's when I received Jesus into my life. I had been having really bad nosebleeds and even gone to a witch doctor for help, he explained. But at this meeting, Jesus healed me. As a result of this conversation, Sally told me there had been a total turnaround in his life. In the last few months, he had spent every spare minute studying the Bible. He had been out distributing Christian pamphlets to his non-Christian friends, joined a team from his church, and even went out preaching in the surrounding villages. I looked into the eyes of this young, zealous man. He had been deeply affected by the film that he had been shown. But coming to a school in Salisbury far from home and mixing was met with mainly middle-class students would be a major adjustment. I was not sure he had the maturity to make it. Yet, I was drawn by his sincerity. I could see that he was a rough diamond who, with some cutting and polishing, had the potential to be effective for God. Put your application in for the school, and we'll pray about it, I told him. Salu's letter arrived. I prayed, but still felt unsure. Would he fit? He had no financial backing and no means of support. Despite my misgivings, something drew me to this young man. Just days before the school was due to start, I decided to risk it. I sent the letter back of acceptance, and Salu Daka became our first black, male Rhodesian students. The other 4 blacks, all female, came from South Africa. Running a multiracial school, the very first in the country, was indeed a whole new ballgame. Held at the YWCA, it got off the ground in January 1974. Not only did we have to relocate to a less exclusive area, we also had to lower our standards of living. There were no more paid workers to do the cooking and scullery duties. We could not afford them. In our first school at Rest Haven Holiday Retreat, the fees had been set at a rate equivalent to other Bible schools. Now, in concession to our black intake, we lowered the fees. Even so, our 5 black students who, like Salu, came from the poorer homes struggled to pay the minimum, reduced rate of 15 Rhodesian dollars per month. This was a mere portion of the total fee. I decided to take the bold step of putting black and white students together in the same rooms. For many, particularly the white Rhodesians and South Africans, this was the first time they had had any close social contact with blacks. They were used to servants in their home, but not to treating them as equals. It took humility, and in the first few weeks caused a few upsets. But to their credit, none of the students pulled out. Even though it was a major adjustment, they all stuck with it. I'd expected my greatest resistance to come from the white students. To my surprise, those who found it hardest to adjust were the blacks, in particular, the black Rhodesian teenager, Salu. My initial assessment of Salu proved to be true. He was a rough diamond, but it was not until he got into the school that I realized just how much polishing and cutting still needed to be done in his life. The first hint of his problems emerged in the classroom. Whenever any issue of remotely racial nature arose, Salu was quick to inject his black viewpoint. In running a multiracial school, we were slashing into jungles of prejudice, and I had expected differences. But it took a few weeks before I realized just how deep Salu's racial hatred ran. A few weeks into the school, I was packing away my notes after a lecture when Salu's white roommate approached me. Rudi, can I talk with you in private? I picked from the agitation in his voice that it was serious and agreed to see him straight away. Our YWCA facilities were limited, and my bedroom one of the few places where we would not be disturbed. Come, we'll talk in my room. As I perched on my bed, Salu's white Rhodesian roommate sat on the lone wooden chair in my room. What's the problem? I asked. It's Salu, he burst out, his jaw set in determination. I cannot continue rooming with him. I've really tried, but it's impossible. I sat, stunned by his adamant declaration. A normally easygoing young man, I had deliberately chosen him as perhaps the most suitable person to share the intimacy of a bedroom with Salu. I knew Salu was a tough nut, and I felt this young man, of all the students, would get along with him. Obviously, I was wrong. Dismissing it as nothing more than a personality clash, I moved Salu into another room. But when, after a few days, his new roommate came complaining that he also found Salu difficult to live with, I realized the problem ran much deeper than I had anticipated. I really began to pray. I decided to take Salu aside. It was the weekend, and we had been working with some of the other students packaging tape cassettes in our downtown Salisbury office. Let's take a break and go for a walk, I suggested. As we dodged the empty glass bottles and cigarettes packed carelessly tossed on the pavement and strode along plaster-peeling storefronts, I turned to him. I decided to take the direct approach. Of all the students, I surmised that he was one who would take it on the chin. What's the problem, Salu? I like this young man. He had a zeal for God, and so far he had always been respectful towards me. But I was about to witness a side of him I had not seen before. He continued walking, staring sullenly at the rubbish-strewn pavement, but not speaking. I kept in step, saying nothing and waiting for him to answer. When there was no response, I decided to dig further. 2 of your roommates have come to me complaining that they can't get along with you, but I want to hear your side of the story. I'm okay. He kicked an empty bottle out of the way and stared at the ground. We continued walking on in silence. Approaching one of the few inner city parks, we sat down on the rusting iron seat. I tried another approach. I know something's bugging you. Can't you tell me what it is? I gave his thigh a friendly tap. Salu brushed my hand angrily aside and looked me direct in the eyes. There was a darkness emanating from them that startled me, but I knew I was getting through. Is it the white-black issue? I asked in an attempt to dig deeper into his rocky resistance. I struck oil. For the next hour, I sat listening as a torrent of bitterness gushed out of his mouth, and I came to appreciate with new understanding the philosophy that motivated this young man's life. For him, white people symbolized oppression, something to be despised. Whites were exploiters. He saw the minority white Rhodesian farmers tilling vast tracts of fertile land, while the poor blacks eked out a living on a few poorly cultivated acres. His hatred towards anyone with white skin had been so ingrained into him as a child that Sally had never conceived of socializing with a white person, let alone having one as a friend. To consider them as an equal was unthinkable. As with so many of his fellow blacks, he had retained a sullen attitude of servitude towards whites, but had kept well away from them. His 3 years as a Christian had brought only a veneer of change. He had always attended a black church and had minimal contact with whites. Before coming to the school, his abject hatred of whites had remained rooted deeply within and largely unrecognized as a problem. It was only now, in the multiracial soil of the school, that his true feelings on racial issues began to surface. As he poured out his bitterness, expressed his hurts, feelings of rejection, and sense of inferiority as black, there was little I could say. His emotions were real. What Salu was expounding was not just his own hurt. He was speaking for perhaps the majority of his fellow blacks. I placed my hand softly on his shoulder. It was rigid and tense. But I knew that even by letting his true feelings erupt, a breakthrough had been achieved. It would take time, a lot of love, and a great deal of patience. But I was hopeful that eventually God would be able to break through and soften the stony resistance that had been so much a part of Salu's life. Change was gradual, but it happened. During the next few months, the school cemented together and genuine friendships between black and white students were established. This mostly occurred in the very natural ways, sitting together at meals, discussing the latest teaching, enjoying a joke together, doing work duties, scrubbing floors, and even cleaning toilets. It all helped to break down the barriers. Probably for the very first time, our black students saw whites not as the superior race, but as a normal human being. Whites who, because of our limited budget, were willing to eat substandard food and carry out menial tasks, which in this culture were usually assigned to blacks. For their part, the white students gained a new perspective and respect for the blacks, recognizing them to be equals in intelligence, whose ideas needed to be listened to and not ridden over or downgraded. Just mixing with one another and fully participating in all the school activities together helped to bring about that integration. For the first few weeks of the school, Salu kept company mainly with the black female students. He would sit with them in lectures, and if the program of the school forced him to mix with white students, he showed associated with them out of necessity rather than choice. As we got into the school, however, a change started to take place in Salu's heart. Almost in spite of himself, his genuine love for Jesus, his eagerness to learn his ways, and his longing to lay down his life for the Lord's service began to take precedence over his long-held attitude of racial hatred and reserve. The changes surfaced in little ways. I noticed him one day, for instance, smiling as he was drying dishes with a white student. Obviously, something had occurred that amused them both. On another occasion, I saw him deep in conversation at the dining table with a white South African. They lingered long after the rest had left. Initially, the signs were intermittent, but it was clear his hardened attitudes had begun to soften. Then there were those definite moments of change. For example, the day I shared a message of giving up your rights, I watched Salu closely as I explained that none of us has any rights, even the right to hold on to anger or bitterness at racial inequity and injustice. Although Salu gave no outward show of emotion, I knew the message had touched him deeply when over the next few weeks his behavior towards the other white students dramatically altered. While he remained the tough young man I had first encountered in Bulawayo, by the time the lecture phase came to a close, I was confident that a genuine change of heart had taken place. I was totally relaxed about letting him join the outreach team that was heading for Rhodesia's western neighbor, Mozambique. Salu himself had felt strongly that God had called him to Mozambique. Besides, this was one of the few foreign nations where he was permitted to travel. White Rhodesians were issued with British passports that gave them free access to the world. As a black, Salu only had an ID card, which allowed him to visit only Angola and Mozambique. Salu would be the solitary black on the team, but I was so confident of a transformed attitude that I was sure there would be none of the blow-ups we had experienced at the beginning of the school. The blow-up I was more concerned about was a political one. In April 1974, the nation of Mozambique was in political turmoil. For 10 years, a fledgling black, Moscow-trained communist resistance movement called Frelimo had been waging guerrilla warfare in an attempt to overthrow their hated colonial rulers, the Portuguese. The better-equipped Portuguese government forces had held out against the resistance fighters, but recently, a revolution in Portugal had weakened their power and the Marxist communist Frelimo was steadily gaining ground. But they had not yet tightened their atheistic grip on the country. Under Mozambique's old colonial power, evangelism was greatly restricted. Right now, there was an open window of opportunity. In the atmosphere of change, with their old Portuguese bosses rapidly leaving, the general populace was in a mood to listen. I had first visited Mozambique on my own in 1971, when it was still firmly under colonial rule. The previous September, I had joined a team from South Africa, and we had gone in on a brief weekend campaign. By then, the iron grip of the Portuguese colonial powers had started to weaken. We had wonderful freedom to share the gospel, and had saturated the town with literature. We held open-air meetings and prayed with people on the streets for salvation, something that would previously have been impossible. The people were amazingly hungry, and I recognized Mozambique was a ripe harvest field for the gospel. During the lecture phase of the multiracial school, Don Malam, an American I had met during the outreach, came to visit us in Salisbury. He had set up a teen challenge center and was working with drug addicts in the capital of Lourenço Marques, today renamed Maputo. He told us how the Frelimo were fast gaining control and that the door of opportunity would close any minute. They urged me to send one of our school outreach teams to help them. I knew I was taking a risk in sending my students into such a volatile area, but recognized this was Mozambique's time for harvest. I did not want to miss it. I chose the team carefully. The leader was a former hippie named Tom Bauer from California. Long-haired and easygoing, Tom had been traveling the world when God caught up with him in Rhodesia, and he committed his life to the Lord. He attended our first school and then joined our school staff. I felt confident in his leadership. Another advantage, he had a minivan. He and two others would drive the van via South Africa. Salu, because he was not permitted to enter South Africa on his black Rhodesian ID card, had to take a train directly to Mozambique by himself. As I waved the gray Mini off and put Salu on the train, my heart was full of expectancy for them. There was a great harvest ahead of them in Mozambique, and thankfully the team would not be on their own. They would be working in Lourenço Marques with Don Malam and his team. Even so, I still felt some concern. Mozambique was fast coming under the grip of Frelimo's communist control. At any time, the door would close. As in the previous school, we also sent teams into Zambia and South Africa. Instead of joining up with any of the outreaches, however, I had opted to stay in Salisbury, where our tape and literature ministry needed my attention. Along with my YWAM work, I was now the official Open Doors representative in Rhodesia, and as a result, getting more and more invitations to minister in churches and speak on missions. My particular focus continued to be our literature outreach to the Chinese working on the Tanzam Railway project. The Redbound Gospels were still getting out to them through the Catholic White Fathers and other missionary organizations that had captured the vision. While Simon Malay's church in Dar es Salaam remained the hub and main outlet for the books into Tanzania, our YWAM teams, such as the one currently in Zambia, were also servicing the Chinese in the Copper Belt area. My position as Open Doors representative gave me contact with overseas Chinese Christians in South Africa. I visited their churches and exhorted them regarding their responsibility to pray for the Chinese who were captive behind the bamboo curtain and barred access to the gospel. I also informed them about the opportunities they had right on their doorstep and how they could get involved in our literature outreach to the Chinese Tanzam railway workers. We may not be able to be missionaries into mainland China, but God has brought them right to us, I challenged. At the same time as exhorting them, God was rekindling my own vision for the Chinese. I had now been 2.5 years since I had had any hands-on experience in distributing the Red-bound Gospels. How I longed to make another trip, but that would have to wait. In the meantime, I was preparing for the students' return from their 2-month outreach. Impressed by the example I had set through our multiracial school, the owners of the Rest Haven Retreat Center had taken the bold step of allowing us back into their beautiful facilities. Admittedly, we were assigned to a camping area on the edge of the extensive valley that housed the rest of the center's facilities, set apart from the main buildings. The students would need to sit on hard wooden benches for their final week of reporting back, instead of the comfortable molded chairs used in our first school. Paint was peeling off some of the walls, and instead of the fully equipped kitchen, we would be cooking camp-style on gas rings and were without ovens. But even to be allowed back into the Rest Haven as a multiracial group was a major breakthrough. It was with excited anticipation that I waited for the vehicles to come rumbling through the gates. I could not decide what I liked best, seeing the exuberant students excitedly wave goodbye when leaving for outreach, or when their vehicles came limping back, more bumps and bangs than when they had left, but filled with students who were brimming with wonderful stories of God's faithfulness to them. They tumbled out and, unable to wait for the official reporting time, began immediately relating experiences of God's provision, the people they had led to the Lord, and all the literature that they had distributed. It was great to have them back, but there was one car that I still waited anxiously to see, Tom's gray minivan. During the 2 months in Mozambique, I had no communication with them. I carefully followed newspapers and radio updates. News on Mozambique was not good. Frelimo's leader, Samora Michel, had tightened his communist grasp on the country. Freedoms had already been taken away. I prayed daily for God's protection and for the team's safe return. No news is good news. I was confident my prayers had been answered, but I would be comforted to see them and know they were safe. I breathed a great sigh of relief when I finally saw the gray Mini turn through the Rest Haven gate and head towards the campsite where we were housed. A shout went up from one of our students. Tom and the Mozambique team are back. Along with the other students, I crowded around and welcomed them, offering a silent prayer of gratitude. Thank you, Lord, for bringing them back. They emerged from the van, and there were hugs and shouts of reunion. Then I noticed to my horror that the one black face was missing. Salou was not with them. The team had driven direct from Mozambique to Rhodesia. I could see no reason why Salou could not have traveled with them. Had my confidence in him been misplaced? Had he had a disagreement with his 3 white teammates and gone his own way? I stood back as chatting and squealing students greeted the team. Then, as they faded away, I went over to Tom. I gave my scrawny, long-haired coworker a friendly hug. Great to see you back, man. We were getting worried you wouldn't make it. He beamed at me. We had a wonderful time, Rudy. You wouldn't believe it. The people of Mozambique are so open. We literally plastered Lourenço Marques with Jesus posters and lost count of how many books and Bibles we sold on the streets and literature we gave away. We led so many people to the Lord, one of the girls added, coming over to join us. Yes, it's certainly a ripe harvest field, Tom agreed. I grinned at their enthusiasm. Had a good time, eh? Honestly, none of us wanted to come back, another of the girls piped up. Well, it looks as if you didn't all make it. What happened to Salou? He didn't cause any trouble, did he? Oh no, Tom quickly replied. He had a wonderful time. He felt such a strong call to Mozambique, in fact, he decided to stay. He's already learning Portuguese at the university, one of the girls enthused. Tom looked at me anxiously. Don Malam said it was okay for him to remain with them. I hope I did the right thing leaving him there, Rudy. It's fine, Tom. I was just worried when I saw that he wasn't with you. He was so determined, even if I had tried to make him return, he would have refused. Tom added. I nodded. I can understand that. When Salu sets his mind to something, he can be pretty tenacious. Salu may have softened in some areas, but he was still the same tough young man I had first met in the missions meeting in Bulawayo. I was just glad that the Lord had gotten hold of him and that his zeal was being redirected. The report week over, the school broke up and the students scattered. A week later, Tom also decided to return to Mozambique and work with Salu and Dom Malam in the Teen Challenge Center for Drug Rehabilitation. News of them was sparse, but from what little I did that did seep through, it appeared God was continuing to move in Mozambique, and in the chaos of the political turmoil, people remained open to the gospel. In the meantime, I was preparing to make some changes myself. Oh, there we go. So that is the end of chapter 13. Next chapter is called Arrested. So that'll be interesting. I'm not going to let you read that. There we go. So you can find links to purchase the book if you want to read along with us by heading over to missionarycoach.org. You can find all that. Now, so the work that I do with Youth of the Mission, I've been full-time with them for many years, and it is a volunteer position. So if partnering with us, if supporting the work that I do is something you want to do, again, head over to missionarycoach.org. You can find out how. So thank you so much for listening in. I'm glad you were able to join us, and I look forward to catching up with you again next week when hopefully things work out better and we don't have any sound issues.